Welcome to The Conversation. On today's episode of Trailblazers, we talk to Dr. Mo Ali. Mo talks to us about AI and machine learning and how they are impacting doctors' ability to treat and diagnose mental health conditions. We also talk about how technological innovations might enable doctors to become better clinicians. We hope you enjoy this episode and be sure to subscribe.
Hi, today we're joined by Dr. Mo Ali. Mo is a partner in one of the largest practices in the UK. He also is a non-executive director of one of the largest mental health trusts in the UK. Today we're going to be talking about innovation within healthcare and how the perception that healthcare systems are slow to innovate might not be all that it seems. Mo, lovely to have you here, sir.
Good to see you, Johnny.
So talk to me about why our perception of healthcare systems being slow to innovate might not be all that it seems.
So I think I'm going to describe it as a myth, but a reputation that the healthcare system has is that innovation in it is actually quite difficult. So people run out of steam and they stop innovating, or they don't go from end to end on their innovation. So what I wanted to do was describe actually how we have made leaps and bounds if you look over a slightly different time horizon. And I can give you multiple examples of how we have shifted. So if you look at care that we started with, if I go back to just 100 years ago. So just over 100 years ago, what you had was what we are very proud of in the UK is the National Healthcare Service. Mm-hmm. And so once it came about in 48, actually its first origins, if I take it from a GP perspective, was the concept of everyone is entitled to some degree of healthcare. So if I took the first iteration of it, it probably was in 1911, where we had the National Insurance Act, and that was only for working men. That triggered from the Boer War, so actually it was warfare related as to why we thought about it and why it came into the UK existence. And that was we didn't have men fit enough to go to war. And one of the theories around that was around people having healthcare that was personalised. And so they inspired the Insurance Act, where if you're a working man, you could pay a small amount and you'd have a personal physician. You'd have a personal doctor. That's where GPs came about.
That's really interesting. I had actually had no idea that it went as early as 1911 that we had some form of healthcare system.
And before then, it was only for the rich. So you had to be wealthy enough to be able to pay for somebody, or you went to a charity place. And often these were typically religious institutions that you'd go to, and health itself was considered either enough for you to keep you working, to be able to put food on the table, or when you were sick, you were isolated and you were taken off to one of these religious institutions where you were secluded from the rest of society.
Yeah.
And that's a little bit of the slightly darker side of where doctors learnt their trade.
Oh, wow. We'll steer clear from that one a little bit before we depress people too much. So when we're talking about these time horizons and we're talking about innovations coming into healthcare systems, tell me a little bit more about how the timelines that we see at the moment may not be all that they appear with. We think that there should be more innovation with tech, with AI, with machine learning. Talk to us a little bit about how that's playing out now.
So I think one fallacy I want to break very early is we often think about healthcare as one homogeneous entity. And I think that's where the innovation journey gets stunted when it comes to people thinking around whether you can innovate in healthcare. So the bit I want to unpack, even the NHS, 3 lovely acronyms. We have religious fever and a belief as a country that that's what everyone's entitlement to it is, and it should be. What we miss is the beauty of the heterogeneous nature of healthcare. So the healthcare that you have here, so once we're trying to standardise it, actually the beauty within it is actually innovation happens in pockets, in tiny pockets. And it's the tiny pockets that then have to build up enough momentum to get to a tipping point where it gets spread out.
Yeah.
And what we then miss is the beauty of the pockets. And the beauty of the pockets is what accelerates learning. And it accelerates people's access to healthcare, access to understanding the science and how the science moves and how we apply it to your own healthcare. And I can give a few examples around that, around where it happens. So if I'll give you a couple of examples of both generalized healthcare and then some sort of localized pieces. So if I take a generalized piece, I'll give in our lifetime, because it's topical at the moment, we talk about extending life. If you look at, if we go back to my 100-year analogy, actually just over 100 years ago, most people were dying of either traumatic disease, you died going to work and there's an employment component, or you died of infectious diseases. And then as we had vaccinations come along, and people will go back to Victorian eras around clean water, but as vaccinations came along, people lived long enough and free of diseases, and we had antibiotics and a few other things happen. Then you lived long enough to have the luxury, I'm going to describe as a luxury, of dying of cardiovascular disease. So suddenly you live long enough. It doesn't feel like a luxury. It doesn't feel like a luxury at the moment, and people have different connotations around what you can eat and exercise. But actually, you had to live long enough to suffer with the consequences of cardiovascular wear and tear. So then we started about heart attacks and strokes. And a pivotal example, and this is where we talk about statins, it's a good example. So this is during my medical training, it was almost like the advent of evidence-based therapy. Suddenly we had a drug that came in with statins, and I'll leave the controversies around what people believe to one side, but we had evidence for the first time of taking something that extended your life.
Yes.
And that was previously unknown or unheard of, because before we'd measure something in your blood, we'd apply something that would change the chemical makeup of what you'd have, and we'd try and prove it and isolate it scientifically to say, if you do this, it will do this. And we sort of looked at, can we lower cholesterol? And that's what we're looking at. But actually the underlying theory of that was, actually, if we could reduce the plaques, the impact should be lower heart attacks, lower strokes. And suddenly we had a study that started measuring those other outcomes. And it was the first advent of something we could mass produce that showed a longevity effect on people. And that's where the statin story came in.
Interesting. I mean, that sounds very similar to sort of what we're seeing at the moment with metformin and rapamycin, these other compounds that were developed maybe to treat something else, but they're having cross-application in longevity, slowing mTOR pathway, all of that sort of stuff that ultimately will mean people live a longer health span, not just lifespan.
Absolutely. And there's something there around what we want to do is add quality to life rather than just add years to life, and make sure we've matched the two together. So if I sort of go back to the innovation of that, actually, well, the reason why we could roll that out was, and people probably don't sort of see the way systems work, but if I say, actually, well, where did statins get rolled out? And if I use what's the delivery mechanism of how do we benefit from the science that healthcare produces? So actually, for statins to have been effective, we need to ensure that we have someone who can have a measurement somewhere in society of their health, someone who can follow them up, someone who can deliver the care. And this isn't me advocating for GPs, but me saying that you need a healthcare system that can pick that up for the population to be able to have that as a population benefit. And that's the beauty of what we get out of having a healthcare system. And why I'm saying, actually, we underestimate the impact of the rollout of that once you get it going. The friction points is that first tail end of what do you first do at the beginning when the science starts emerging, and are you getting the system ready? So were we measuring cholesterols? Were we doing scores of working out who was at risk? Those were things that I probably argue, whether it's the pharmaceutical industry, whether it's others, we need support in place to make sure that those components are thought about as we diffuse innovation.
So creating that infrastructure that allows for the smoother rollout of these innovations to get to the patient, to get to market. I think we spoke previously, and you used a lovely analogy about having, a fighter jet and this amazing piece of technology, and then trying to land it on a dirt track. And so having these pockets of innovation that you've spoken about, where you're able to get these wonderful new developments, you need to facilitate that access in a more smooth runway, so to speak, so that you get it there. What are some of the most exciting things that you're seeing at the moment that are, being developed in these little pockets of innovation?
Yeah, I'd probably say there's a huge amount, and there's a swathe of. Often we look at things. So if I say, let me describe some of the negative connotations people talk about healthcare. And when you deal with people who are more future leaning, and you'll start seeing those with those who lean into the innovation. So if I talk from that perspective, and I say, let's say, what are the challenges all healthcare systems face across the world today? So overall, we have an aging population, and what that carries is a burden of greater disease. So there's more need for healthcare. So you've got increased need for healthcare on one side, and what you have on the other side is a decreased amount of delivery of that healthcare. So you have fewer in the workforce. We're not training as much of the healthcare professionals as we may need, knowing that the healthcare demands are going to go up. Now, if you put that together, everyone talks about this perfect storm. Now, if I flip that around and I sort of say to you, actually, if you roll in the technological advances we have, and there's lots of topical debate around artificial intelligence, machine learning, but now if I amplify that and I say the worth of one of those healthcare professionals in whether it's a physiotherapist, a nurse, a doctor, actually if we enable them to work smarter and to distribute their skill set, their precious skill set across a broader scope of people they can support, suddenly actually that isn't a mismatch. Or the glue we're looking for in the middle is how do we accelerate their productivity? And how do we ensure that what you have on the other side in terms of as people get more and more attuned to what impact their actions and their lifestyle behaviours or other things that they have on their healthcare, you put them together and you've got a perfect blend of something that means it's not a crisis. We just need to find the right glue to bring those two potential problems together into a solution. And we have the advent of that today with all the wonderful things we have, technology and with machine learning capabilities that are coming down.
Yeah, I mean, a perfect example of this that I think about, and this is from my own lens with my father, a stroke patient who is in the recovery journey, and how you could facilitate, an AI kind of movement tracking piece that lets you know how well they're executing an exercise, that then feeds into a centralized kind of system where that physio can understand, okay, Hugh Isaacs, he's adhering to his program, he's getting along with the work that he's doing to recover like this, that's great. But then there's this other patient over here who maybe isn't adhering to their program, they're not checking in on the system, they're not checking in with the exercises, so I maybe need to stage a more acute intervention with them and understand why. It's enabling a smarter way to work, like you say, and leveraging technology to be combining AI, machine learning, kind of smart systems and centralized data and all of that sort of stuff to actually facilitate better patient care, which is a wonderful thing. What are some of the other challenges that you think we might be able to solve with these emerging technologies, if there are any that stick out to yourself?
Yeah, I mean, you described a wonderful example there around the big barrier patients talk to me about regularly, whether it's in the practice or if I think around with the mental health and community trust I work with, it's around access. So there's this real precious resource of a handful of people who have expertise, and there's a burgeoning demand of people who need more and more access to that. And I'm going to, hey, this is me as a GP now, so I'm going to use GP as an example. So look, I'm sat here with you today who's seeing my patients, and there'll be the complaint around, oh, well, where are the GPs? What's going on? And actually what we've missed is, I'm going to use a very strange analogy now, but you'll get the bit around how we've utilised technology to support the challenges. So if you look at the banking industry, if you look at even all of us going to supermarkets now, what happens is there's a lot more of, it's not just the person, the cashier on the till who's doing everything for you. What you do is you're engaging, and it's not for everybody, but you're engaging with a whole group of people who are happy to go around, and I'm one of those crazy ones who'll pick up the scanner, I'll go and scan my stuff in because it's quicker. Particularly if you have kids, it just saves the arguments that go on at the end when you do the checkout. I'll go and scan all my stuff in, pop the scanner in, and just pay and walk out with it. Not had anybody touch anything. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying that's for everybody, because we still need the aisles, we still need the others for different people with different needs. But what's happened is they've had to invent that. Now, what that's done is, for a lot of it, it's reduced the burden at the front, and it's allowed them to have fewer cashiers. You can argue it's an economically driven component or not, but actually people are ready for that. People are ready to do a little bit of the work themselves. Now, what's the equivalency on the healthcare side? I think what we underestimate is the potential of our patients to be able to contribute to that. And for us, we're patients as well. So if you look at if I say we've had a watershed moment, and that was with COVID.
Yes.
So what happened before was we were playing around with triaging tools, with other things where actually, before you came to see your GP, do you know what? We had this blind moment of crazy nonsense, which if I say it to you, we still do it today. But if I was coming from the outside and I was designing the healthcare system, you'd think it's mad.
Yeah.
So you have a healthcare professional sat on the one side, blind to what people are going to come in with, other than a healthcare record, and you'll pop up with anything. Healthcare professional doesn't know where to direct you until they've had the conversation. And the barrier we're creating is fictional, because actually you could have told me before you got there what you wanted, and we could have had that exchange earlier on.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we've started to invent now. So whether there's multiple platforms, the one we use at the practice is eConsult. It was a popular one throughout COVID, and we were using it before COVID came along, but COVID accelerated it because that was the only way you came in. Now, doesn't fit for all patients, but now we have a huge degree of our patients coming through where we know some of the issues. Some of them just want a note, it's an insurance form, there are admin pieces. Before, historically, you'd have to wait in a hour-long queue to book in, and all you wanted was a form filled in.
Yeah.
Actually, now you can fill that in and say, all I need is a form, drop through, and then we'll process that for you. You don't have to see anybody. Now, you could argue, well, why didn't we have that before? We probably had it, but we didn't trust the system. And now patients are happy to fill it in. Some who don't feel comfortable with it, language barriers, technology isn't their first source. We still have all the other access points. But like a supermarket, we want multiple places where we have that technology enabled. Now, if I add a layer on, what we don't have right now is a full end-to-end checkout. What we're about to start seeing is, and we've seen it with NHS 111 systems, the ambulance service use, triaging tools. Can we do an end-to-end one where it's not trusting Dr. Google, but
Yes.
we have validated tools we can give to patients that allows them to triage through. The bit that we get lost into is the governance of, well, if the computer gets it wrong, whose fault is it? And that's almost the wrong lens to look at it through, because we have, right now, if you got advice from your mother or from your aunt, from your grandmother, nobody ever criticised what happens if your grandmother's advice was wrong. But now suddenly we're using technology which is actually more validated with a back engine of lots of support that can direct you to, if it's urgent, go here. That's far better than what we've relied on before. And that's the advent of allowing a more informed consumer, and in fact informed consent, with a ability for that one healthcare professional now to see probably 10, 20 times more, and for them not to feel completely swamped and overwhelmed, but knowing, actually the example you gave around physiotherapy, they know the person they need to look after, the person who's not responding.
Yes. I think that, there's so much to unpack there.
Sorry.
No, but it seems like there's a social accelerant component that was almost key to this transition. And also I think what you've highlighted is this kind of moment that we're in at the moment where you've got, we've spoken about the aging population, but it's also, we've got a population that is more accepting of technology. They're less scared and wary of it. So they're more embracing of these systems. They're more embracing of the fact that I can fill in a form. I know that my GP is going to be able to review that and give me the note that I need. I trust that the systems are going to be rigorous enough and strong enough to take that, and that I'm going to get a decent output for it. The other side of it as well, I think, is that, with that kind of short patience that I suppose that we've all now got because of the self-checkouts, because of Amazon, because of all of the other technologies that we have, we kind of just expect that to be part of the service. But it also means that, exactly as you articulated there, that GP is able to help more people. And we have a system where, look, we have 10 minutes, often with a GP to sit there and to go through. So the ability for that GP to have some context as to why are you going in, like, hi, Mr. Isaacs, you're going to talk to me about this today. These are the things that I should be aware of ahead of that consultation. It gives you a chance to actually be of greater service and be more effective. It gives me more peace of mind that I know that what I'm going in to talk to you about is going to have, you're going to have some context around that, because context is kind of everything when you're looking at all the different factors that might be contributing to someone's healthcare outcomes. I think that, more and more, where do you see, I guess there's a question, as I said, there's so much to unpack here. The question that comes to mind is like putting that ability in the hands of the patient to provide that context. Where do you see things like, potentially even like wearables, the data streams that we might be getting from these platforms like your Aura, your Whoop or whatever, in being a part of the consultative process and that sort of journey with a patient and their GP, where might things like that take us? That's a whole possibly other podcast episode in and of itself, but let's get into it a little bit.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to lean into it. And I think, look, there's lots of things, and even as a practice, we're looking to experiment with those areas, because what we don't have at the moment, and I think this is where you have that flux between the medical components here, where what we're looking for is validation, standardization elements, and knowing what to do with something. And what we almost have, I'm going to describe a funny moment to you from a doctor perspective, from a healthcare professional perspective, not just a doctor perspective, is we've been trained to typically always use one measure. So I'll give you an example. So with, let's take blood pressures. We'll do the validated blood pressure check when you come in, and that's the version of truth we believe in. And what we've been brought up with is, here's the nice guidance of, for your age, for your comorbidities, this is what your blood pressure should be, and these are your thresholds. That's what we learn. What we know scientifically is your blood pressure varies throughout the whole day. And all we have is we take one snapshot at one moment in time, and that's what we're using to titrate and give you something to help, if that's what it is, or give you lifestyle advice. Now, what we haven't figured out, because the science hasn't caught up with this, is now if you have, instead of the one measure I might use with you over a month, that happens to be when you've come in and I've stressed you out and it's slightly higher, and I don't know what you're running at when you're at home. Typically, there are some measures where we do a 24-hour monitor, we do something else. But that's usually assimilated for us, and it gives us one reading. It means, Mr. Isaac, you're above the threshold, I should do something.
Yep.
What we haven't established yet is what happens when you load us with information that you're tracking minute by minute. And that's the piece we need to get ourselves over, which is, because then we go into the risk averse moment of, actually, do you know what, if one of those came back bad and I missed it, what would I do? So let me be honest about my anxiety about it. It's us establishing some rule sets, and that is coming. So there are lots of studies out there, lots of ways of using technology. Now, the question that you're asking is, at what point are you going to see me saying, actually, can you upload your data into your own record? And actually, we already technically have the ability to do that. The question is, at what point do you want the healthcare system to intervene? That's the piece we need to almost have the contract up and ready for, which you can go and collect as much data as you like, but the bit I don't want to be overwhelmed with is not knowing how to construct and consolidate that into, okay, so what are you asking of me now?
Yeah.
And that's where we need to get to, and that's going to take a few iterations. So I think we're seeing movement trackers, we're seeing devices, even if it's dietary pieces, people come to me with...
Zoe, like you've got your continuous glucose monitor that used to be something that you'd only have if you were diabetic, but now that's become, I want to know what my glucose response is to eating a bag full of muffins. I can be pretty confident in what that's going to do to my... but,
And the bit I need to be open about here is there's an anxiety that goes as a healthcare professional, because actually I'll put my hands up and say, I don't know what to do with it. So you'll come in and saying, actually, well, it goes up. And I'm thinking, well, you're not diabetic. You have a normal response to it. And that's nice for your health and you want to accelerate your health. But actually, it doesn't hit my radars around, now I need to be worried about you. And then there's that amount of learning to have that discussion that we're not automatically trained to do. And so I think there's a Rubicon that actually I'd probably say we've crossed already. So let me add another layer to your thinking, and that's to say, so you're talking about what we'd go into, and I'd probably say we're already there. Because if I say there's generational shifts, and let me give you a generational perspective, and I say the Gen Y, Gen Z, the alphas coming through, they already do that.
Yep.
In fact, they trust their device more than they trust me. So if I go back to actually what we describe as the silent generation and the older population that I deal with, I know that when they come to me, I will say something, and I know that they will take that as fact, and they will know the doctor said it, and that's the validation they're looking for. Every other generation going down, I know for all my millennials right now, I'm opinion number 3, because I've already Googled it, I've already researched it, And patients come to me with the sheets now. They'll be like, "Oh, I've checked this," and part of my role is making sure they've gone to a validated website. It's not their social media feed.
I'll just
they're
add
working
Chat
off.
GPT onto that now as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a bit about helping them go to reliable sources, and that's my role now. Is that what I signed up to do? Probably not. I'm like thinking, hold on, I've studied for years. This is sort of that's what I'm here to do. And now, who am I competing with? And it feels like, actually, am I competing? I'm not. What I've had to learn to adjust to do is realise and accept. By the time I've got to your millennials and your Zoomers right now, I am opinion number 4, and actually I've learned to accept I'm opinion 4. And what I've learned to do now is I've asked, what else have they looked at as part of my consultation? And that's an example of the shifts happened.
Yeah, and I think that's it's a really good point that you raised, though, that I think the doctor now, maybe in part of that role, is the ability to think critically about the things that the answers that you're getting. That maybe, when you're invested in something, you're Googling it or you're looking at different sources and what have you, you probably are maybe scared, you're anxious, you don't have an ability to look at something maybe dispassionately for the facts that are there. And so that critical thinking to be able to say, okay, well, yes, I'll take a look at everything that you're presenting me with here, but let's look at some other factors. Let's look at this holistically, and then we'll go forward from there. I think that's going to be one of the changing roles, as you say, with GPs, with doctors, with clinicians, with everyone in the healthcare profession. And with knowledge comes great responsibility, to quote Uncle Ben. And I think one of the things that this leads me to is we're seeing a lot of this innovation, and we've spoken about this previously with physical tracking, with physical diagnoses. What are we seeing in the mental health space? As it's playing catch up, as we've spoken about previously with physical health. What are some of the things that we're seeing in that space?
So I'd probably say it's earlier on in its journey than physical health. So I'd probably say physical health, if I professionalize it and I'll give you a medical perspective here, the medical professions have been around for centuries. And mental health has only become organized over a century, as it were. So it's on a different time horizon. And what we're doing is we're sort of seeing it shift from what I would describe I'm talking about dark histories, but if I talk about the dark history of mental health, there was a
sometimes
degree
you can't get away from it.
Yeah, and it was there were elements which were mixed up with social control. So who are the outcasts of society? And I'm going to give you a funny analogy now. So and I'm going to go back to the days where we had asylums, and they're within our generation. It's not like a far distant memory. These were, as I came into training, the asylums were just being closed down. That was during Thatcher's time. And at that point, actually, it was those who were outcasts in society, not following society's norms. And these were as extreme as if you were a woman who was unmarried, having a child, actually you'd qualify to get shipped off. And we're in London at the moment, to get on the outskirts of London because nobody wanted an asylum on their door patch. Pushed out and were part of managing that group in a different community. And so there's a lot of learning that went in as to how do you treat what I describe as the real mental illness rather than social ills. And science emerged around that worked really well, and we've understood it better. And I think that's the infancy it's grown up into now as the asylums are shut, and we're actually moving away from institutions and institutionalization to actually how do we work with people. And recognise that mental health is the spectrum of norm. So actually some of these elements, whether you look at mood components, whether you look at thinking patterns, actually it's the extremes that are the pathological ones, and the rest of us fall in a myriad, and people flippantly use terms around feeling a little this or a little that. But what we're seeing now is the advent of measures, of validated tools, of getting better at understanding the brain, and we know little about the brain, and we're right at the infancy of understanding how that works and how we measure it, and those are getting better. The therapeutic interventions, whether it's and we talk about the therapeutic intervention as part of the counselling and the talking through, is another one that's been emerging, and we look at the chemical changes that we can have in the brain as well, And they're things that are emerging right now when we're learning more and more and more. And I have full confidence we'll know how to bring it together with physical health. There are lots of tools we use in psychological techniques. If I think about mindfulness or something that's become fairly widespread right now, actually that has a huge impact on, if you look at physical health impacts and you look at actually how do people stay well for longer, people turn to mindfulness, and they're techniques that we use for patients with mood components. But now they become daily interactions. They've mutated with people talking about, actually it's how meditation works, how if you look at Hindu traditions and others where you look at meditation actually, and Buddhists, they've been doing it for years. It's us catching up with the science.
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing the evolution take on.
Yeah, it's funny that you talk about that kind of like catch up and you know, the 80s being that prime example. Michael Pollan has an amazing series on Netflix, and his author of a couple of books, I think one of them's called How to Change Your Mind, I think is the series on Netflix. And he was talking about the research that happened with compounds to do with kind of schizophrenia, addiction, and all of this sort of stuff that unfortunately suffered as a consequence of the war on drugs in the States. So it's very interesting that we are playing this game of catch up with mental health, and that we are adopting older traditions that, you know, these were things that were just part of your daily practice of reflection, being able to mentally unpack what you were going throughout the day, that in our fast-paced life now, we're in a disease of busy. If you're not doing something, you know, you can sit down for 5 minutes and already you're thinking about, okay, I should be doing this or I should be doing this. Having that moment to just even sit and reflect quietly, to give yourself the mental space to unpack everything, is so important. And yeah, it's as I say, I find it so interesting that we're in this moment where we've lagged behind, but then it's almost like we've lagged behind, we're catching up, but then in catching up we're reflecting back to older traditions that were there. It's almost like we've just forgotten about them and lost them for a little bit, but that's really, really interesting. Are there any what does the future hold for that space, do you think, and what does the lean into that look like in the future?
So I think it's an exciting time in multiple ways. I think there's so almost as you talked about, we're sort of rediscovering compounds. There's a rediscovery, but there's also a known history with the impacts of some of these things. And I think there's something there around how do we apply the science to it to be able to have a different conversation. And we often talk about mental health as being a Cinderella service to everything else in physical health. So one of the big things I'm hugely passionate about, and in the practice I'll give an example about how we've brought some of those elements in. But the future is very bright. So if I think around, you've got the application of science, we talked about earlier on around machine learning, AI. I'd love to see that application in the design phase of, as we learn more about the mind, as we learn more about the neurotransmitter components. These are all things that are emerging as a science. And as we go deeper on it, then the compounds that make a difference. What are the existing compounds that make a difference, and how do we start proving the science around what makes those material differences? There are connections we don't fully get, and give a physical health example. There's a funny one because it affects diabetes. So I talk about with diabetes, we're slowly learning around the impact of neurotransmitters on your gut hormones, and you'll hear lots of people talk about gut biomes and other things. We're still working out actually how do they interact, what do they do. And it is through these frontiers, the different groups will get better at doing it. What is special about the machine learning capability is we can input a whole load of things now and come up with some other ways. So take COVID as an example. COVID was feasible about us accelerating our ability to get to a vaccine because the information was shared and we had different ways of being able to work out what the construct of the antigen looked like and which one was the most possible. We had international teams working on it. And with the investment going in now, that'd be a dreamlike state if we could do that with mental health. But we're not far off being able to do that. We just need to be able to direct and think about how we do that and start building up a bit more momentum as people seeing the direct linking. There will be more interest and research that goes into it. And the offshoot, if I give an example, within the practice, one of the things that's big to us is recognising the components of not just the mental health component, but I talked about as we learn more about the way we think, we've had lots of input over the years around diversity. One of the big things we've had a huge focus on in the practice around neurodiversity. We don't talk about, you'll hear the rise in autism, the rise in a topical one right now because the medications aren't as easily available as ADHD. There's always a debate around, well, what triggered it? And if I say, actually, it probably existed in society for a long time, we've just labelled them in different ways. It's a bit like the mental health labels we gave to awful terms we use for people with what we described as a lower IQ or something else, and that's how we bucketed them into different groups. People who are disruptive, and actually what we didn't do was think around, actually they're not disruptive, that's normal. But what we didn't do was give them environments where they could thrive. And so what we're now seeing is actually as you start understanding people, we don't talk about them as being disruptive. I'll reference anyone in particular, but as we've learnt to be more accommodating, we've got people in our own practice, and so we have 80 direct staff, with about 140, 150 people who work with our practice. And as people have become more open around a diagnosis of ADHD, actually we've learned more about where are they best in terms of applying their skill sets. And there's wonderful moments where we can have them thriving, and for them it's around stimulation. I'll use generalizations at the minute, but then actually they're wonderful when it comes to triaging, fast-paced, they need the stimulation. What they're not really good at doing is, and you'll recognise some of these characters in our own practice around, they'll be the ones with the disorganised consulting room, it'll be the ones who'll come in late, and what we've learned to do is it's not around us now asking them to conform. We're upending our process, and we're thinking around how are we more accommodating and how do we use them to their best potential with what skills they have, because they've got superpowers on what they can do that the rest of us can't.
Yeah.
And those are some of the advances on the neuroscience, and that's an example of where we're getting better at it. For those who are medicated, we're noticing when the medications are on, as it wears off, what do we do on their work day? We give them their focus work in the middle of the day, and we start thinking about what we do at the other ends of the day. And that's us being a better employer, being a more sensitive employer. Think about autism around social interactions, how do we reduce noise environments, how do we pocket out spaces. They're things we're only learning now, and that means a hugely productive workforce and people being valued in the right way. And that's made a huge change, and that's because of the advances in mental health.
I mean, that's so beautiful, because it's not pigeonholing someone into a particular box. You're actually creating the flexibility in the space for someone to lean into their superpower, as you say. It's actually a beautiful analogy that Simon Sinek uses all the time. He recently was diagnosed, I think he says, with ADHD, and he views it as his superpower, his inability to focus when he was sat down in a school textbook and he's unable to concentrate. But yet he is so fantastic in his ability to draw what other people would consider very disparate connections and bring them into centralized concepts that he can articulate really well. That is a superpower. So you creating that environment that enables those people to have that flexibility, to have that space, to feel valued, to feel like they're a contributing member of the team, to feel like they're actually doing meaningful work and not feel like, oh, I'm just a problem. Which is, I think, unfortunately, what many historically kids have felt if they've, not been the perfect student. Yeah. They've been labelled as disruptive. They've been labelled as kind of, oh, you're not getting this. We're just not going to focus on you. We'll focus on the people that do get it. I think that's a really, really, as I said, I think it's a really beautiful thing that you're doing with the workforce. I'm going to go on. I'm going to ask a slight tangential question. With your consulting and the consultations that you do with your patients, we spoke about kind of machine learning and AI and stuff. There's stuff that's coming out now about, the ability to pick up on certain cues via expression, via language and all that sort of stuff for things that maybe a human might miss. Is there any ambition in the future in the healthcare arena to overlay these types of technologies? We're seeing it in the corporate world with kind of, particularly in sales, around kind of like, oh, what could you have done to get that deal over the line? But I think there's a more interesting application within particularly mental health, and that's where this comes from, in identifying maybe those people that, you know, we're in a bit of a situation at the moment with, particularly with men, who are, you know, 75% of the cohort of people unfortunately take their own lives. Is there technology that's coming in from what you're seeing that's going to be used to help combat that with these things that I just spoke about, in terms of understanding the cues and the things that you might miss?
Yeah, no, there are, and what we're seeing is sort of a whole raft of things coming in, and I think then it's the classic sort of, when we talk about sort of simple and wicked problems, and so let me focus on the question you've raised around men and suicide. So it's a huge issue in terms of, as a topic that we do talk about, and it's something we've brought up not just within the practice, but things I often hear about within the trust as well, around these events are tragic events, and it's one of the things I think mental health organisations get caught up with, in terms of they get labelled for probably the wrong things, which is treating the extreme end of society who have a lot of needs. And when you're dealing with a large group, we almost look at it the wrong way around. We look at an event and then overlook at, could we have prevented the one when it was multifactorial? And the question is, how do we get into the multifactorial nature, which is the point you're raising? And this is, how do we enable tools which allow a clinician and a healthcare professional to be a super healthcare professional? And you know, this is a bit we don't talk about, which is, I'm sure if you look at all of us, you catch us at the beginning of the day, you've probably got my best self, and by the end of the day, I'm knackered, and am I as sharp as I would have been at the beginning? Maybe not. And if I give you, and I think this is where, and I have this discussion with a lot of clinicians who are fearful of technology, and if I say there are certain ways, and I think we need to get better at how we communicate this, which is, how do you become a better clinician? And that's what these technologies will do. So the face recognition you talk about, actually, if I had something that could prompt me to remind me, actually, do you know what, I might have missed it because I was looking somewhere else, or I was thinking about something else at the time, but it helps me get better. And the analogy I give is driving. If I look at driving right now, actually, we've made driving a safer experience with things that probably when we first invented them, it's like, oh, this is really irritating. Think about parking sensors, lane detectors. If you think around the fact that it will automatically stop and prevent a sudden stop, actually they've saved lives. We've never counted them. That's the reason why we don't talk about it. But if I take it from a driver's perspective, I'm not qualifying my driving as I say this to you, but it's definitely improved my driving.
Yeah.
You know, so if I say, where can I park up, I'm more confident parking up than I would have been around, actually, have I used the mirrors properly, knowing that I've got sensors, I've got cameras on. And it means I'm allowed to now get into spaces safer without any problems. So actually, I don't think of technology being the barrier, it's made me a better driver. And that's the mindset we need to get to. So when you talk about, well, how do I get to a point where I can intervene quicker? Actually, what I need is the computer reminding me that, once I've seen, and you know, that we have this conversation around, if I see younger men coming into the practice, they're my rare group who come in, and automatically there should be a flag up for me saying, actually, I'll take them 2 or 3 times more seriously because they don't come and see me, and for them to cross that threshold to see me, there's something very serious. Now, they might come in with something mundane, but is my antenna high enough? Have they caught me at a point where I can pick that up? If I had something prompting me, and we have a few prompts on our computer systems, but how could I make me a better clinician? And that's where we need to aim. So there are self-reporting apps that are coming in. There's things like Mind Gym and others, which does CVT and flags that come in that route. There are things around what we do on the consultation, and could we get to a point where we can get those flags? The short answer is yes. The challenge, I feel, is bringing them in and making sure we've tied the cues together so that the patient and the outcome we're looking for, there's a better result where that's picked up earlier.
Yeah, 100%. I think the reality is looking at it not as a threat, but as another data point that you have to draw from. And that helps you, you know, as we spoke about, the patient that comes in with 4 different things that they've looked at, you have the critical ability to look at all those things and then layer on other data points that you can have access to bring the whole picture together. That's all this is. is it's enabling you to, pull on a little bit more data, a little bit more insight, a little bit more information that helps you inform your decision and the treatment pathway that you can, look towards directing someone down. And I think that that's so key in particularly this area, because one of the other terrifying things that, I realised as even on top of that 75%, is that actually a lot of those men had already sought help. They had already sought to speak to someone that could, help them not feel the way that they felt. And that obviously is a terrifying thing, but as the advancement of technology comes along, if we have that opportunity to reduce that number even further, that's a wonderful thing. From something that's probably quite dark and a conversation that we could have a longer conversation with regards to tech, I think one of the questions that I had for you is, what are some of the things that you're most hopeful about with where innovation is playing a role within healthcare, what the opportunity spaces look like, where we're going in the future, and give us a little flavour of some of that stuff.
So one bit that hugely resonates with me is this whole bit of technology is there to make us better at living a higher quality of life. And from a sort of healthcare perspective, what we really want to do is move away from what I would describe, and there's a historical legacy here. So when I talk about the history of healthcare systems, they've all been taken up from a historical legacy perspective. And what the historical legacy we've taken up is charitable institutions and religious institutions who've set up hospitals. They then got incorporated into the national framework. And we've never revisited where was our starting point. If we were ever to design a healthcare system, we'd never design it the way we did, because what we're designing it around was charitable institutions building it out. And where that goes into is we had hospitals, so when you were sick, you went somewhere. What we never got into was how do you keep a population healthy? And then if we're to go down that route, and that's what we want to talk about healthcare systems as improving the health of the nation, it's a very different conversation. Because then what I'd want from technology, so what is my hope in technology, is to do that piece of actually, if you're getting to the point where you're having to come to me to ask for help, I've asked the wrong question. So if the system's response is you have to come and ask me, and I haven't figured that out with you, then that's what we need to fix. And that's what my hope is in technology. Technology will pick up the early signals and the markers with a whole history of data to know, bring those 2 points, and there's a great example actually, I'll talk about it in a second, but to bring those markers together, which means that I intervene earlier now. And if I use the mental health example, what we've known with schizophrenia is actually the people who, if I took it 50 years ago, what we knew was if you left people untreated, you lead to almost like a dementia state later on with untreated schizophrenia. What have we learnt with the science is that earlier you intervene, the more chance you have of that person leading a normal life. And it's only been probably 10 years, we've had early intervention teams in most of the boroughs where they treat children. They're looking at people with early signs, and they're looking at teenagers early on, because the rest of it was older, what I describe as burnout schizophrenics was the term that people would use. They've had it and they've been untreated for a long time. And now that we're treating people earlier, they have a longer, higher quality of life that we need to go down. Now, if I go with where's the technology moving and what's my hope with technology, I'm going to use a funny marketing example. This is a US example of Target. And it's a real story. And his name was Andrew, I've got his surname now. He was a data scientist and he was a statistician.
I think I know this story.
And what he did was, it was the complaint Target had where he'd been pairing different sets of data together and worked out what they were trying to do was preempt what they wanted to market and sell to somebody. And what they knew was as people were buying buying patterns. So what he did was he picked, if you're buying this and this, actually typically if you looked at the data, the next thing that you'd buy is this. And what that related to was pregnancy. So what would happen was, if you bought these things, it was typically they knew you were pregnant. And so therefore what they're going to try and sell you next was baby clothes and christening things. Now, obviously the bit that he'd done was he'd just done the data piece. And where the complaint came into Target was, a father furious that his daughter was written to around having a baby. And so he complained to Target, and then he later found out that his daughter was pregnant. And how the hell did Target know before he did?
Yeah.
And there's a predictive ability of what do we do with data. And that's the hope and that's the beauty. And so the thing that I'd want to do is all these things we talk about, all the lives lost, all of the poorer quality of life, it's not around me waiting for you to come to see me.
Yes.
If you've come to see me, I've failed. That's where I'd love technology to take us to.
I mean, that is absolutely beautiful, and that is, I think, the perfect summation of what, you know, Peter Attia talks about as transitioning from medicine 2.0, which is kind of like where we've gotten to now, to medicine 3.0. That idea that the patient is empowered with data, where they can come to you with way markers as to, okay, these are the things that are kind of like the challenges, and you can say, cool, this is what we need to be looking at right now that's going to prevent you from getting problems down the road. And that leads you to better health outcomes long term. 1,000%, that would be a phenomenal world to be in. And hope for me is that there seems to be more of a lens on that now.
Yeah.
I think more and more people are focused on that, you know, preventative rather than reactive route to medicine. But yeah, I think getting from you know, acute interventions to preventative medicine is absolutely the goal, right? It's got to be.
It is, and let me do here. If I was going to talk about one plug for something we personally believe in as a practice, but also something we've leaned into, and that's so one of the bits. If you look at the saviour, and this is where technology comes in, is around shifting our construct of health. And I'm saying this as a professional here, because I'd love to think the service is all about me, and it's not. And I think the more I can shift it away from me, actually, the better I'll be as a doctor. And the group we've engaged with, and we should be very proud that we have one of these in the country. It's around the concept of self-care. So not too far from here, Imperial, they have, and this is my plug for them, a self-care academic research unit called SCARU. It's part of the population health team at Imperial. It's one of the few gems I'd probably say we have around what I would describe as a saviour for healthcare systems, because what we don't acknowledge is we're so busy and the political system gets so lost in moving the deck chairs around on the supply side, which is, or if we just moved one of the chairs over here, miraculously the healthcare system will change. It won't. What really bends the inflection of the demand is actually if we gave and we built more agency into our patients and our public. And so if I was to talk about what I'm hopeful technology will bring, SCARU and units like that are adding the scientific validation to where self-care needs to go. It's part of the World Health Organization remit. They've put international markers out there, and as a country we're contributing to it. And what I'm proud is, as a practice, I'm probably going to get shot now as I say this, whether we've officially declared or not, we're working with units like SCARU because we have, our average age in the practice is 30. And that's over 70,000 people with an average over 30. Actually, if we could get better at helping them help themselves, actually it's not around an economic thing, it's just a factual point of actually they stay healthier for longer. And surely that's the reason why we're here. And so the more we can build the science around that, the only problem with it is the investment doesn't automatically come because there isn't a molecule to sell, we've got technologies that should be engaging, and we need to figure out the investment line on it. But that's where the future has to be, and that's where the technology has to marry up with the self-care. And how do we get that promoted? Because that's what will bend that inflection curve on demand.
I think that's a really interesting point that you've kind of raised around, yes, there isn't a molecule for that, but I guess there's always going to be resources, there's going to be research, there's going to be all of the other benefits that have come with probably the development of those molecules that then can empower, and the knowledge just needs to be distributed and disseminated in a different way. It's not resulting in a drug that you need to take. It's actually an intervention that you could make in your lifestyle or something else that you can figure out, and other levers that you pull.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I love the idea that we're moving towards that, and I love the fact that you're working with SCARU and doing that. What are some of the biggest changes that you see coming up over the next bearing this in mind, what are some of the biggest changes that you see happening over the next 5 to 10? Obviously, in where we are right now, 5-10 years seems like a very long time. But what are some of the things that you see on the horizon over the next 5 to 10 years?
So one of those areas, so if let me give you maybe a couple of anchors that I'd project as things that I'm interested in and we're looking at. One is almost an acceptance and it's almost like an acceptance of our fate, but it's an acceptance with a positive look at what that means. And one of those is recognizing that doesn't matter what colour of political party we talk about with governments, but to recognise that we will never have enough healthcare professionals. And if I started off that as a point, then we can have a sensible conversation. And if we don't, how else can we care for people in the right way? So my hope here is that will then force us to look at new work pathways where technology will enable us to look after people and look after more people and be better clinicians with a greater degree of access for people to be able to get in. So one shift I expect to see is moving away from the doctor is it. And this is where I probably say the Gen Ys and the Gen Zs are already there. They don't go there first anyway. So how do we engage with them where they can teach us? How do we build the healthcare systems of the future? And we'll see that shift. We'll see a shift of healthcare professionals behaving very differently using the technology inputs we've talked about. So that's one element on the supply side. The other part is, we've seen the emergence now. People talk about ChatGPT, but actually the back engine of it is around people not having to be technology experts. So the exciting part for me, both on the public side but also on the professional side, is suddenly I don't have to learn Python. For me to go off and ask the computer something, I can actually ask what I want. And the large language modules that all of these deep learning pieces offer now is for me to have a conversation, and it's the computer understanding what I'm asking it and coming up with a solution. So I'll give you a funny example. We did this recently because I had a debate. Oh, my partner's going to kill me now as I say this, my GP partner, where there's debate around actually do we know what the average age of our patient is, and we could technically run it, but now we're so large, Excel we're too many patients for the Excel sheet. We had this sort of joke around, could we take the raw data of just numerical ages and could ChatGPT figure it out for us? And I was marking ChatGPT's homework as we're going around, because then I did it manually as well. But there's the bit around actually it could. Well, if we input it, and the thing is, this is us having conversation.
Yeah.
Now, if you imagine if I did that just 2 years ago, I'd have to have a team of academics I'd have to pull out from Imperial saying, look, come and have a look at my whole list. Can you tell me what this looks like? And the technology is there, but what's exciting isn't me going to my software provider, me just asking. And if you imagine historically, I'm hugely curious around what we could do. So the language modules is something that's fascinating. Because suddenly it's like even my kids now talking to Alexa or to Siri. You back end that with the power of a processing that you have with, whether it's Bards or ChatGPT, and just think that what that could do. My biggest thing right now is you've got my parents and my father who struggles with something that talks back to him, and my kids who've been brought up with that's just normal human interaction. You then layer on with the analytic capability and somebody actually coming up with an answer that's not bad, and you're looking at a whole different revolution. And then I layer that on with that's a public revolution and a professional healthcare system revolution, where now I'm no longer having to be an Excel expert. So as Copilot comes in, others come in, I'm not promoting Microsoft here, but the ability to talk is what will be king. And that's really interesting around where will we be in 5-10 years time, when actually you don't have to do anything other than say, actually, can you upload this and tell me what I need to tell Dr. Ali?
And that's really interesting, because that conversational way of dealing with things is a much more human. And isn't it ironic that technology is enabling us to actually be more human and have more of those conversations together?
It is.
Mo, this has been absolutely wonderful, man. I think there's so many topics that we could dive into deeper in subsequent episodes, and it's been an absolute pleasure. Where can people find you? How can they engage with you more if they want to talk about any of these things?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to So I've got multiple routes, but whether it's directly, I suppose probably shouldn't give my email out as such, but LinkedIn is probably the easiest thing if you want to drop me a note. But there are other groups I work with who I'd probably happily promote if there are sections that people are interested in, to help direct them to people who are really doing the work. I think I'm just a mouthpiece for all the wonderful work, and the privilege I have is working with some very smart people.
Incredible. Well, we'll get those links and we'll put them into the show notes. Thank you again, Mo. This has been absolutely mind-blowing. I hope that you've gotten as much out of this conversation as I have. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've just learned so much. My brain is swimming. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for watching. And we really hope that you like, subscribe. We'll put the notes in, the links in the show notes, and then everyone have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll catch up with you soon.